Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Meagan Strout, and I'm the CEO of TAC Advisors. And today I am joined by Kiah. She is now a head of ops, but has had a very interesting career in administration throughout startups and venture capital throughout the Bay Area. And so I'm really excited to have her join us today to share a little bit about her journey and the pivots that she's taken and a lot of stepping into the unknown into positions that I think will be really beneficial to this community. So before we jump in, I just wanted to go ahead and make sure that for those of you who are joining us for the first time, you know that we cannot see or hear you. Hopefully you can see and hear us though. So if you do have any questions for Kiah or myself throughout this webinar, feel free to throw them in the Q&A. And I'll make sure to be monitoring that throughout this session. And if you want to share anything or let us know where you're joining us from today, go ahead and throw that in the chat function. So Kiah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course, I'm excited.
I'm excited too. Well, why don't we kind of just get started by telling people a little bit about how you initially got into the administrative role. And a lot like me, you kind of started in high school, right? At a company called Cloverleaf Ranch, and worked through high school and college and in a somewhat quasi administrative role. So can you tell us a little bit about what that was like and some lessons that you learned in that position that have really set you up for success in your career now?
Yeah. So yeah, it's a summer camp. So summer camp by summer and functioning ranch throughout the year. So they do horse boarding and you can rent out for birthday parties and all that kind of events and stuff during the year. And I started going there from when I was 7. My first summer on staff was the year I graduated high school. And every summer I just took on more and more responsibility. Until the last 2 or 3 summers, I ended up as resident camp manager. So we had a resident overnight camp program and a day camp program. And that's where I really, I think, started to kind of dig in on the admin side. Part of management was taking shifts, being in the office, and really dealing with parents coming in for questions, scheduling and planning. Like I think people I've had people actually dismiss my camp experience on my resume before. But there's a lot of complexity to it when you think about, you have 100 kids there for the week. They all have to sleep in cabins. You have to break them up by gender, by age range. You have to make sure there's enough counselors per cabin to be with the kids. And then you also have like days off and things like that to ensure that staff get time off, but that there's still somebody, you're not leaving the kids in a cabin all alone by themselves. Yeah. Then you have activities too. So you have, not scheduling tennis at the same time you're scheduling basketball and all of that kind of stuff that goes into each week. And you do that for 9 weeks in a row every summer.
Yeah.
So that's really where it started. And then towards the end of my college experience, I was in Sonoma County and I started working there full time. Mm-hmm. And so that was really, I think I had a good opportunity where the owner really trusted me to kind of figure things out with her, things that I didn't know how to do or I'd never done before.
Yeah.
And so I started doing all the ARAP. I started running payroll. The last summer I was there, we were reaccredited by the American Camp Association, which is like 4 2-inch binders thick of policy stuff that you have to like put together. And then they actually come out at the end of the summer and walk through all the policies and do a tour of camp, and you have to answer all these questions they ask you, and then they'll reaccredit you, which is a weird tie-in to what I'm doing now with SEC stuff. But yeah, so that's kind of where I learned. It was a very young staff, so also managing for the first time people that were international and US based who, were 18 away from their family for the summer for the first time. Getting homesick, but also having helped kids that were homesick. So a lot of complexity that went on every summer is kind of how I started to get my feet wet.
Yeah. I mean, that's amazing to experience, leadership at a very young age, some important business skills, right? Like APAR, managing books and QuickBooks, like doing a lot of this stuff that a lot of people never even have exposure to in their career. And having that at a very young age, I think is really interesting. And so after college, you ended up moving over to a company called Advantis, right, which is a recruiting firm. So you have seen this side of the coin,
Uh,
and how did you get that job? And had you ever like, did you even know what recruiters did? Because when I got my first job as a recruiter and I got an offer, I didn't even know what recruiters did or what exactly I was walking into. So
no,
tell us
and
about that.
honestly, they had different titles that made it sound a lot more salesy too, which I didn't also. It was like an account manager was the person dealing with the client side, not recruiter titles. And so I think going into it, I didn't even know. I was like, oh, it's like they sell stuff. And I'm like, oh, they're selling
They
people.
sell people.
But like, yeah, selling people. And so I think this was my first lesson in how valuable and important networking is. And I think something I don't think I even realized until you and I were chatting the other day that I've never actually like applied cold for a job.
No.
And so this one was actually someone my dad knew a headhunter from his work experience who connected him with a different firm that was doing a temp to perm placement at Advantis for an ops coordinator role. And they brought me on for a 6-month temp to perm role. And after 3 months converted me to full time. And this was my next big lesson. And you don't know what you're doing and you got to figure it out. It was like everything back office. So the recruiters, it was mostly contract placements, and the recruiters would, place candidates at client sites for set amounts of time. And everything else went through me and my boss. So contracts, weekly timesheets, all the benefit enrollment if they qualified, like all of that stuff. And there was a really high volume. And so I really learned that you had to be kind of organized. I created all these checklists. I had like a clipboard on my desk where I would like check stuff off, just to make sure I wasn't dropping any balls or missing anything. And then I also started to really work on internal stuff too. So onboarding and offboarding of internal people, events for the team, all that stuff.
Yeah, I love that. And so first time really seeing like back office in a more corporate setting. I think we could say that Cloverleaf wasn't really like a corporate environment.
Not at all.
At that point, you ended up, after I think a couple of years of working there, you took some time off, which I'm sure was a little bit scary because you were living in the city, you had to pay your own bills. What was that like, and how did you make that decision before eventually stepping into your next role?
Yeah. So I honestly had reached a point where I was burnt out and I wasn't happy anymore in the role and what I was doing. And I couldn't imagine going and interviewing and like positively trying to pitch my skill set and myself to a new company. And that was a flag for me. And something I do think, like, I've always been pretty self-aware of my emotions and feelings and how things are going. And so I decided for myself that I would take the risk of not having something else lined up and leaving, and knowing that I could provide enough value that I could find something pretty quickly if I needed to, but that I needed a couple weeks to just not be working and kind of get myself back to who I was before I went and tried to convince somebody else that I was amazing and they should hire me. And so it was scary, but I knew it was the right thing to do.
Yeah. And so once you had that time to hit reset, rest, figure out what you wanted to do next, how did you end up getting into your next role, which was with Expa, which I know when we met, I was like, did you know at the time how big of a deal Expo was? And you're like, well, back then, like nobody knew what Expo was, but maybe you can share with our community a little bit about like what that transition looked like, what Expa is, and why it was such a kind of monumental career trajectory role for you.
Yeah. So I actually went back to the agency I had worked with to get the role at Advantis, but I got connected to somebody on the permanent team. So I didn't want to do another contract to hire placement if I didn't have to.
Yeah.
This recruiter that I worked with was actually the client side and the candidate side. So they knew intimately there wasn't any of the kind of background of like, hey, I think this person might be a fit. Tell me more about the client. Like she knew intimately my skill set and the company, which I think really helped.
Yeah.
And connected me to the EA of the founding partner at the time that I joined. So Expa is a startup studio. So their whole model was to venture invest, but also build companies internally based on ideas by the partners. So now they do a healthy mix of starting or incubating ideas within their studio, as well as venture investing, which touches back to range. We'll get there. And so when I joined, he was only partner, and they had just closed their first fund. And my first week, they signed their lease to a new shelf space office. So same thing, you know, I think in the interview process, I really just pitched that I was scrappy and capable and I could figure things out. And immediately just kind of took over doing the whole office build out, doing the day-to-day office management. We started doing a lot more event programming. The more companies we spun up that were sitting in the space with us, the more we did like demo days and speaker series and all of that kind of stuff. We then opened another office in New York, hired office managers for San Francisco and New York that reported into me. And it just kind of went from there. And so by the time I left, they'd raised their second fund. There was like 6 partners. And yeah, I think the networking piece too, right? Just given who the partners were and the world of tech that they had lived in prior to coming and being a part of Expa meant that there were a lot of really influential people coming in and out of the office a lot, which really gave me an opportunity to like network and be with them and be around them and get to know them, which has helped a lot now and further in my career too. And just watching how they interacted and how their relationships with those people helped Expa grow.
Yeah.
But that could all, you know, emulating that for myself in my own career too.
Yeah. I mean, you really had this amazing opportunity to be a fly on the wall with some of the greatest entrepreneurs and thinkers in the world.
Yeah.
Which is incredible. And that was really the first time, right? Because Cloverleaf, you were sort of the only real G&A employee doing back office stuff. At Vanis, you were really the only, I think, did you say that the founder had an EA or not really? Were you kind of the
So there
primary
was
G&A
no,
person?
yeah, there was no EA at Advantis. I reported into like the director of HR and ops, and the two of us were like the only back office function.
Yeah. And so Expa, I know, had some pretty stellar EAs. And as they grew, you know, they just had some more and more incredible people join their team. And so what was that experience like coming in, seeing what a really stellar, badass, pardon my language, but like badass executive assistant powerhouse can do? Like what was that experience like and what did you learn from that?
Yeah, I think there were 2 sides to that learning. I think that the EA that was supporting the founding partner when I first joined was really amazing, but a little bit more like earlier stage support. And so she really helped get him to a certain point through Expa that is what he needed, and reached a point where she realized for herself, her own career, she wanted to go to something else. He needed kind of that next level of executive support and brought in somebody who to this day is a very dear friend and mentor to me, who I've learned so much from. And when she first started, she supported some very influential people in Silicon Valley, very seasoned. And I remember being really intimidated. Going to the managing partner that I was reporting into, and I was like, I really want to, you know, ask her if she knows anyone to do like a speaker series or whatever. And he was like, just schedule coffee with her. And I was like, I can't ask her to go to coffee.
Yeah.
And he was like, just do it. And so I did. She was so nice. And you know, that was the first time that I think, as I thought about what I wanted to do next in my career, I think we all know that unfortunately there's a lot of stigma around EA and traditional secretary titles and that kind of role. And so I think not having really seen it in my career, and not having seen it done in that way, you think of it very much as just like calendar and coffee and administrative support. And watching her work was really an opportunity for me to see like, okay, no, this person is like truly a right-hand thought partner and is like executing on stuff, and like executives of these other startup companies are like going to her for advice and input before they go and pitch something to the founding partner. And so watching her really, I think, was a huge step up for me career-wise in learning and evolving in what I did next, honestly.
Yeah, and she played a pretty big role in sort of taking you under her wing and giving you guidance once you became an EA too, right?
Yeah, I still call her to this day if I don't know what to do about something.
Yeah. What are you mentioned like you saw, you know, she played this role where even other founders would come to her and ask for advice, and she really was a thought partner, not just to her exec, but like really of the whole company. Were there any specific lessons that she taught you that really stood out that again have kind of taken you to the next level in your career as you continue to grow?
Yeah, one that I reference all the time that seems really silly, but has done huge favors for me is don't ever turn down a seat at the table. So I remember there was a time that I had gotten invited to join something, and I was a little bit naive and frustrated about the fact that it was like, hey, Kai, can you come take notes during this conversation, instead of being fully included in like the brainstorm or conversation at the level I maybe felt like I should have been. And I was talking to her about it, and she was like, well, why? Like, you're still in the room. Like, why would you say, just out of spite, don't say no if it means you get a chance to be in the room?
Yeah.
And she was right. Like, I remember even in that conversation, there was a point where I had an opportunity to say something and speak up, and I got included in the next one. And like, I think remembering that even if it's a small thing, it's in the room where it happens, right? To quote Hamilton. But I think that was a big one. I think the other one was watching her decision-making framework around like what could she just go do? What did she have to do, but then tell our founding partner she was doing? And what did she have to like stop and ask first and then do? Or like huge learnings for me that I've taken into every role I've had since then. I think that a lot of people kind of just bucket everything into one area, and that's how they function, where they're always like, okay, I'm just always going to ask first and then go do this thing. And for her to realize like, okay, these are the things, if I get a little wrist slap, but it helped move everything forward and they were busy doing other things, like I'm okay with that, versus like, this is $1 million decision that I can't reverse. And so like, we need to talk about it first.
Yeah.
Was really, I think, a huge observation for me in learning.
Yeah. Sometimes it is better to beg for forgiveness than ask for permission. Is that the takeaway?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. And I think that piece of, when you are really a great strategic partner, part of your job is keeping the trains on track and things moving forward. And so things that could be arbitrary about like what an exec wants to eat for lunch, or, and sometimes they are picky, but in this case, like, you're not going to get in front of them today. So just order it. They don't like it, it's not a big deal, versus, something else that's much bigger.
I think like learning, people reading is another huge part of this that she's also good at. I think I'm actually also good at, and I've like learned from her, because those this decision-making framework also depends on the person, right? Like in a funny turn of events, my CEO now actually is like a huge foodie passion person. And so he like actually loves to be involved in like picking out team lunches and stuff, because he like gets excited. Yeah. And so in my mind, I'm like, okay, whatever, let's move on to more important things. And he's like, no, this is important. Like, but there's 100 other things that I'm like, okay, he doesn't care about this stuff, I'm not going to include him in it. And so I think really you have to really be comfortable like having some of those awkward conversations too, to be like, hey, here's what I'm observing. Do you care about this? Do you not care about this? Like, and just continuing to check in and have those conversations as well, to know that you two are aligned on what decisions I am going to walk away and now go make on my own. And so if you come back and you're like, hey, don't do that, it's like, okay, cool, but we talked about this, so let's check in again. Are we still aligned and on the same page? I think it's another big piece of it too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you make a really big point about this. I was literally just having a conversation with an old candidate of mine this past weekend. And she's like, hey, I'd love to get your thoughts on the situation I'm dealing with my exec. Like, here's what he had shared with me. This is actually what's happening. I'm not really sure what to do. And I'm like, I'd have a check-in conversation. Like, I know that seems a little scary, but just bring it to the table of like, this is what we had previously discussed and you said were your goals and your intentions. Here's how this is actually playing out. Is this still a priority for you? Is this something that's still important? Or have things changed, right? Like, is that no longer something that you want to move forward with? Like, that's fine. But part of the reason why you hired me was to make sure that what you said or your goals are actually getting done.
Yeah.
So I'm flagging to you that they're not getting done. How do you want to handle this?
I mean, direct communication is like such an important part of this. And I know that can be sometimes the scariest part of all of this. And even I'm guilty of this, where you just assume, okay, the person's busy, I don't want to bother them, but they don't know what you don't know until you tell them you don't know it.
Yeah.
And they're not a mind reader and you're not a mind reader. Yeah. And so, even if in the moment they're like, I'm busy, just figure this out, they're still going to appreciate that you're trying to like level set and understand. If your one question can go help do 100 things versus having to ask them 100 times separately about something, let's ask.
Right. Yeah. 5 minutes can save 15 hours later.
Yeah.
And I also think it's funny, but I totally understand what you said about the EA and you initially being intimidated by it. I know who that person is, because interestingly enough, at my last firm, we placed her with you guys. That's how I know the whole Expa background. And she does have like a very commanding presence. And so, I'm curious to know from you, what that experience has taught you, or what you've learned about just not being intimidated by people, or like becoming more comfortable with approaching individuals. Because now especially now in your role, you're dealing with executives at so many different levels. And that I know is something that can be really intimidating and terrifying for people. I actually have people all the time who go through our coaching who say, I have a hard time speaking up. I have a hard time approaching this executive. I'm intimidated by them. What have you learned through that experience or experiences since that help you overcome that?
Yeah. I honestly think a little bit of this is just like how I'm wired, honestly, too. But there's also been moments in my career, like even going back to, pre-Expa, where some things politically were maybe happening and I had to really advocate for myself and speak up, and it wasn't an enjoyable conversation, but I knew like ethically it was the right thing to do. And knowing that I didn't get fired in that moment, nobody nothing bad happened. We just had a hard conversation, went home, got a good night's sleep, and like came back to work the next day. I think the more that you just realize that like, what's the worst, this is what everybody says, like, think about what's the worst that can happen. And
is the worst case scenario game.
And I think, there were moments to, even like at Expa, I remember 2 of the partners were trying to push through something like pretty quickly that I didn't totally think needed to happen in that moment. And I remember being on the email thread and I wrote an email back about why I didn't think we should do it. And I sent it to a different admin person on the team. And I was like, hey, do you think this is too sassy? And woman, this is another thing, right? Is like, you don't want to always be like the sassy one. And she's like, oh yeah, it's like pretty, intense. And I I think I'd already pushed send or something. I like didn't. So I was like, oh, I sent it. Like, hope it goes okay. And I remember I didn't get a response. And I was like, oh my God, I'm fired. They like, email was so rude. And like 2 days later, I went to my managing partner and I was like, hey, like, you guys never responded. Like, what were your thoughts on that note I sent? And he was like, oh, he's like, yeah, I'm so sorry. We totally forgot to respond to you. Like, we chatted about it separately and we like totally agree with you. Like, that was a really great email. And that was a good reminder too of like, I think sometimes in support roles or even as women, like what we think is direct is like still not even as direct as some of these executives have had to experience getting to where they are in their career.
Yeah.
And so that was another good reminder for me of like, it's okay to push a little bit harder.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I think that point of temperature checking with I do it constantly. Within my own team. I'm lucky to have a co-founder who's worked in, very tough environments, but also in like really hyper growth, successful tech companies that I don't have exposure to, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have other team members who, I think surrounding yourself with as many advisors or people that you can trust that have such a varied like background of experience, like technical experience, like personal experience, different people from different backgrounds and cultures and genders, and because everybody interprets things differently.
Mm-hmm.
And that like in temperature checking with those people, like the same scenario, and then taking that information and taking it with like doing your own get check and saying, okay, like this is actually how I'm going to handle it. I do it constantly all the time. And so building that network of advisors for yourself, like you had that EA, you had these executives that you trusted, you continue to do that. I know you're part of quite a few organizations, Let's Talk Ops and
Operators Guild.
Operators Guild, right? Like surrounding yourself with those people who are great knowledge partners for you.
Yeah.
I think is super important.
We had a really great exec coach that called it your board of directors, like find your own board of directors.
Yeah.
That you keep and gut check things with.
Yeah. Before I have any type of hard conversation, I've like role played it with my therapist, my co-founder, and like 2 to 3 other people.
Yeah.
It's written out, like role played. Because I want to know. I want to like have it land as positively as possible.
And each one of them is going to have a different perspective or question that they might ask that you need to be prepared to answer or whatever, that just makes you feel more confident and prepared going into that conversation too.
Yeah. And then the conversation is like way less intense, or like it's way easier the next time around. It's the same reason why I tell people to prep for interviews. Like the more you role play for interviews, the easier the interview actually is.
Totally. The other part, I think, just to your original question of like things I've learned with being direct and having these kind of conversations is very busy people are very factual.
Yes.
And so the more that you can, like, that's the other thing I really learned with our founding partner at Expo. He was really, really busy. And sometimes you would get like 5 minutes for him to like approve huge design changes for like the office build out. And I would think that I had thought through like every question, and I would go in and he'd be like, well, what about blah, blah, blah. I'd be like, oh, like should have thought about that. Yeah. But I got better every time. Right. And so then the next time I went in, I would be like, oh yeah, actually I already have this, or I already printed this out, or here's the links to everything so you can click into it. And I think that's also getting into like the EA world, like having all of that stuff prepared and having just the facts to like answer and dig in and counter stuff also makes a lot of these conversations easier, because it's not just I'm observing or feeling, but it's like, hey, here's 3 instances where this happened. Here's how you responded. Here's where I thought we were aligned. How do we want to proceed going forward? Here's my proposal too. Like, don't make them do all the thinking.
Right.
Like, what's your proposed solution? Don't just throw a problem up in the air and hope it's going to be solved.
Yeah. Can we like underline that for just a second?
Propose solutions.
Always,
Yes.
always propose solutions. We're so tired. Founders are so tired. We're so tired. All we do is make decisions all day long.
Yeah.
It's just such a breath of fresh air when somebody says, here's what I've seen, here's the research I've done, here's what I propose, A, B, or C.
Yeah. It was actually a value at Bolt, which I know we'll get into in a minute, but you weren't allowed to put issues into an agenda for a meeting to talk about without including a proposed solution.
Ooh, I like that rule.
Yeah.
I like that rule.
Yeah. Even if it wasn't like, even if it was like, here's kind of what I'm thinking, we need to research it a little bit more or talk about it. It didn't have to be like a full, like, this is what we're going to do, but you couldn't just be like, I'm throwing a problem at the wall and let's talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea.
Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. I like this. All right.
I'm really sorry
Okay.
to the Tack Advisor employees that are listening.
I know. Take note. I think Alexa's on this right now. Alexa, add it to our agenda for Monday. Sharing it with the team. Okay. So amazing what you were with Expo, I think, for 5 years, right? And your role evolved and you grew and you managed the people and you had this, what was your final title with them?
I think technically it was like space and experience lead, but it was like one of those, let's come up with something weird and techie that's like not a real title, but sounds cool internally
Yeah.
when you like meet new founders that are coming into the office. I think I have operations lead on my LinkedIn.
Yeah. So you have this amazing 5-year tenure, you learn, you grow, you make these amazing connections, and you decide it's time for something next. And so how did you figure out what you wanted to do next, and where did you go, and how did you make that happen?
Yeah. So I had kind of reached a point where, you know, I think this is pretty typical on the venture side where unless you're trying to be, you know, the next A16Z with hundreds of employees, you're not, the team doesn't get that much bigger. And so there wasn't a lot of upward trajectory for me anymore. And so having this mentor that I had watched and observed and learned that like being an EA is actually really cool and kind of badass and you get to be this right-hand person for people. I was like, you know, I think that I'd be really good at that and I want to try it. And I got introduced through a friend to one of the founders of Bolt. And I interviewed there. I was interviewing a couple other places and they made me an offer. And so I joined as the EA to one of the co-founders. And that was a very interesting first week experience for me. So I left this comfortable job I've had for 5 years and I went and joined.
Cush job.
Huh?
It's a cush job.
Yeah, this cush job. And I went and joined this crazy startup. They were like 65 people. They were in the middle of closing their Series B. Bolt, for anyone that hasn't followed along in the news in the last few years, is an online checkout platform. So my 5th day, so I met the other co-founder, Ryan, and CEO on my 3rd day of employment there. So I never interviewed with him. I'd never met him. I was supposed to support the other co-founder. And then on my 5th day, that co-founder let me know that they were taking a step back from the company for personal reasons. And, but I had to wait because they were going to, you know, communicate it to the company in the next week or two. So I all of a sudden didn't know what that meant for me if I was going to have a job. I also was like being trusted with this huge secret 5 days in. And I, again, tapped my board of directors, called a couple people, was like, what do I do? Is this crazy? Should I start looking for another job? And I just decided to trust the process. You know, they were saying the right things. They were like, hey, we as a company hired you, not just the individual. We're going to figure some things out. I think I handle weird, ambiguous situations like this well. And so I was just like, okay, well, here's the things, I started a list and here's the things we need to do. And in the background, I started to kind of like help with this transition, even though we weren't announcing it publicly anymore or yet. And then the person on the biz ops team that had been kind of helping Ryan, the CEO, with scheduling through like the fundraising process went on vacation. And she was like, he came over and was like, hey, can you help me with scheduling while she's on vacation? And I was like, yes, what I was hired to do. But he didn't know me. He never interviewed with me. Like, so he gave me access to his Calendly link. And I had to look at his availability via his Calendly link, send times to whoever he CC'd me into to schedule with, and then either book the meeting on his Calendly or like on my calendar and invite him and the person. Things clearly went okay. And so when she came back, he was like, hey, what do you want to do? And I was like, well, I got hired to be an EA. I'd love to like have a shot at supporting you and like doing this like I wanted. And he was like, okay, let's do it. And I was like, great, but the only way we're going to do it is if you give me access to stuff, because I'm not spending the next year like looking at your Calendly to see when you're available. And he was like, okay, great. And so that started my 3.5-year relationship with Ryan building Bolt.
Yeah. And I think that that's an important lesson just to underscore there. Well, a couple of things. One, super scary to 5 days into a new job, all of a sudden for like you're hired to support an executive. 5 days in, they're like, this executive's not going to be here anymore. And instead of just going into complete panic mode and shutting down, you're like, I'm just going to make lemonade out of these lemons and let me find all the ways I can add value to this company to secure my job, right?
Yeah.
And so you went like right into solution, finding mode, and you were able to create this value pretty quickly and be able to save this position, which I think is great. I think the second thing that is important is that I think you kind of met Ryan as the CEO, right? You met Ryan kind of where he was at when he initially asked you to support him while the EA was on vacation. Like, he wasn't comfortable yet giving you access to his calendar, so you're like, let's just give this a go. I'll use your Calendly link. I can only imagine, I'm like cringing inside how many times you gave availability but you couldn't put like a hold on it, and then like somebody else booked over it with the Calendly link.
I could from my calendar, but it still wasn't.
It wasn't foolproof. Yeah. So bless your heart. Southern in me coming out, bless your heart. But then like you proved yourself, right? So you met him where he is at, you built that trust so that by the time the EA came back and you were able to have a conversation with him, you had a little bit of leverage to say, I want to do this for you, but this is what I need to be successful.
Yeah.
Now that I've done it for a couple weeks, I really just need you to give me access to your calendar to be more effective, right? But you didn't do that like guns blazing coming in day one. Right. And I think that that's another really important lesson to learn of like, sometimes you got to tread lightly. It takes some time to build that trust before people open up the floodgates. So I think those are two really important things. So, okay, so you end up becoming his EA. And what did that journey look like? Because you guys, if I remember at that time, Bolt had grown pretty exponentially and like during that time period. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So I think that any EA listening in on the call today, or whatever title that you're the right hand to an executive, knows that the executives you're supporting and their skill set also greatly defines your role and what you're doing. And so Ryan was a young founder and he was very visionary and he wasn't operational and he wasn't organized, and he'll tell you that himself. And so that meant that I really took over this role of kind of like being that piece of his job. Right. And so, so it started with just, managing his calendar, helping with projects. Eventually I started sitting in on like weekly exec meetings just to take notes and action items and things that he was not going to necessarily remember coming out of the meeting to tell me that I needed to help him do. And I think, again, just going into that problem solving mode, the more that I would like half prep something or do something and come back to him where he never even had to say anything. And it's like, oh, I just know because Kiah heard it. It's like happening. The more he trusted and included me in more things. And so, yeah, we went from 65 employees when I first started in February of 2019 to 700 employees when I left in July of 2022.
Wild.
Maybe 18. Anyway, 3.5 years. So, you know, it was a lot of like, we had to hire a whole executive team. And so it was like helping him with, he was doing the interviewing, but I was like coordinating with the recruiting firm and following up and being kind of the friendly face that the executive got to interact with throughout the process. It was sitting in on board meetings. We eventually got to a place where I was sitting in on all of his one-on-ones. You know, that's not every executive functions that way, but I think for him, one, I was in the room, so I heard all the action items and things that needed to happen. Two, I was interacting with so many other people within the company on a daily basis that I often had context that he didn't necessarily have that was relevant to something him and this executive were debating, where I could be like, oh, sales is actually already working on that. I talked to so-and-so yesterday or whatever it is in the conversation. And then I also really became the sounding board for the rest of the executive team, where it was like, hey, I need to pitch this thing to Ryan to get him to approve. Like, can we talk through the right way to do that? Or even ending a conversation where it was like, hey, do you have feedback on how that went? And so I really started to play that role, and managing his inbox and all of that stuff. So at the end of my time there, I really kind of had the keys.
Keys to the kingdom. Sidebar question for you. We did not at all talk about this. I'm sort of throwing you a loop, but how do you feel about inbox management? Because it's about a 50-50 split of people that I've seen as EAs or chiefs of staff who have access to their exec's inbox. And it's usually about a 50-50 split of people who either love it or hate it. Like, did you feel like that was beneficial for you?
So I think that it really depends on the executive. I think if you're supporting, like, for example, if I were supporting the CEO I work with now in an EA capacity, like he has an operational background, like he's on it. I say something, I ask him to do something, he does it. So that additional support of like filtering out junk or drafting responses or whatever, like just isn't needed for his level. I think for Ryan, again, he was not an operational organizational person. He was writing the doc of like, I have this crazy new product idea that I want us to like try to build and roll out, which is great, and what he should be doing, or he was on sales calls or whatever. And as we scaled so quickly for like day-to-day business needs and things that needed to happen to just keep the machine running, things would have gotten really far behind if I just had to constantly every day be like, hey, is this email in your inbox? Have you responded to it? Did you review it? Did you approve it? Or things would have been happening that I think the company also could have gotten away from him a little bit, where people would have like stopped waiting for him to review stuff and started just doing stuff. And then we would have never known
what was going on
from a managed perspective, but just like, you know, things would be happening that we didn't even necessarily know were happening. And so, especially around fundraising and stuff, like email is a huge part of that, obviously, interacting back and forth with investors. So I think for him specifically, it was very beneficial, but I think it really depends on
exactly
supporting. I know other EAs who have access but never do anything with it, and that's almost more annoying to me, because I'm like, hey, you could highlight this email to this person for me because I need a response, but they can go in and search stuff historically, but they're not like actively assisting. So that's my answer on that.
No, I think I think that you make a really good point. I think that's very interesting context of it. It really comes down to the exec's work style as opposed to the exec's comfort and level of trust.
Yeah.
So I think that's really interesting. So I appreciate that perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, so going back to what we were originally talking about. So how we said what 60 to 700 people. Obviously, you were going to have to scale yourself and scale the admin team. Can you talk me through a little bit about what that process looked like?
Yeah, I mean, admin at the company level, I think I really just started to partner with our talent team to try to think through like what were the kind of titles and things we wanted to be part of it, just making sure that I was part of the interview process. But I also controversial topic, but I'm a firm believer in, not firm, I guess I'd have to try it multiple ways, but as of now, my opinion is that EAs should report to the exec that they support versus a central model. I think that the people team should still be involved in advocating for them and making sure that leveling and all of that stuff is appropriate. But I think that when the executive has the responsibility of managing you, it's a lot easier to build that trust and support versus, okay, you just kind of help me, but you like report in over here to this other department. So I was involved in a lot of that stuff, but I really just let like each exec was kind of hiring their own admins as needed.
Yeah.
And then for us, yeah, we got to a point where I basically pitched to Ryan that I wasn't really doing EA stuff anymore. I was doing EA stuff plus chief of staff stuff. We'd reached a point where I was sitting in meetings on his behalf. I was, people were coming to me and I was making decisions on things on his behalf that I knew he would, again, decision-making framework, right? The things I knew he would be okay with versus not. And to me, that's really what kind of pushes you over the line from one to the other. And so we had a conversation about it. And Ryan actually felt very strongly that chief of staff was this like very senior VP biz ops kind of person.
Grad, yeah.
And so he gave me manager, office of the CEO as a title.
Yeah.
Was a mouthful and nobody knew what that meant.
Yeah.
And so at that point, we started looking until we brought in an EA that reported into me, someone junior who could really kind of like learn and develop, and I could help career-wise. They did calendaring. We still met the three of us every week to kind of make sure they were included and stuff. And then I was doing a lot more of the like sitting in on meetings, prepping meetings, and that kind of stuff.
You eventually got that chief of staff title. So how did you sway him in that direction?
So back to sharing facts. I wrote a doc up and I wrote the whole doc and I basically was like, here are multiple articles I've referenced of like defining what a chief of staff is in the way that I think about it. Here are all the things that I do in my job duties that are like EA, which was like a couple bullets. And then it's like, here's all the things that I'm doing that qualify as this other bucket. And it was a much obviously longer list of things. And I included quotes, actually, Slack messages and stuff I'd gotten from other execs about how helpful I'd been or how they really leaned on me for things. And then I had a compensation part in there too, also highlighting kind of chief of staff compensation, where I was at. And I sent it to him in read only, and I didn't let him download or print it or do anything because I didn't want him to like share it around and get a bunch of opinions. I wanted him to truly just like read, digest, have us discuss and like decide what to do. And I remember I shared it with him the night before we were supposed to have our one-on-one the next day and was like, hey, read this before we talk tomorrow. And he called me that night and he was like, hey, I just read through your doc and I have no way to counter any of this. So we just need to do it.
I love that.
And I was like, okay, I guess we don't have to talk about it tomorrow.
Check.
So I think
like now go
just trying to like,
yeah.
I built out my argument in writing with facts. And to his point, he was like, anything I would try to like counter on this, I can't because you've already written out a bullet point to, counter my counter.
Yeah. Which goes back to all the lessons that you learned kind of through your career, especially when you're at Expo, of like going to the founder and thinking you would
Yeah.
single argument or every single question and coming with a counter answer, which I think is so important. And that's something I learned pretty early on in my career when I worked in hospitality. I had a few really tough managers who were just really, really smart. They were tough because they were smart and they always had a million extra questions. So I really had to learn how to be on my toes and be prepared with answers to their questions and questions I even hadn't thought about, right? But like as you work with somebody long enough, you start to understand how they think.
Yeah.
And so then you can start to like project or understand like this is probably what like the follow-up question is going to be. So that ended up really working out in your favor because you kind of made it bulletproof.
I mean, and time-wise too, right? Like, I think to your point, and to my point in my story earlier, like if I got 5 minutes, sometimes I wouldn't get another 5 minutes for like 3 days. And so it just delayed everything I was trying to do because I had to go back and look for the answer for one question that I, in hindsight, maybe should have already had the answer prepared for.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. And so then you were chief of staff. And then anything about that period you want to highlight before we talk about this wonderful new role you have before we wrap up this webinar?
I mean, we were in hyper growth, so things were just crazy all the time. And I think it was constantly like prioritizing and problem solving. And I think I spent a lot of my job on the relationship side of really just being the glue to make sure that context was transferring appropriately between different executive members and people knew what they were supposed to be doing, and that things were accessible in a way that they needed to be. Like so much of my job, I was joking the other day that I feel like I have so much time. I don't have time, but like I don't have as many meetings now because I used to be
In
in
every
all
meeting.
meetings, in all my own meetings, and then my cell phone would ring all the time in between if someone being like, hey, I want to talk to you before we jump into this meeting or whatever it was. And so that relationship glue, I think, is a really pivotal part in hypergrowth of just ensuring that context is constantly floating around in the right way.
Yeah. And I think that's really, as you move into a strategic EA or chief of staff position, like that's the piece that makes your job like you're not like you're so valuable at that point. Like no computer, no AI, at least at this point in the world, can replace that piece of like that context piece is so critical.
Yeah.
And makes you so invaluable.
Yeah.
So you eventually left Bolt. So what made you finally decide it was time to move on and take on your next position?
Yeah. So in February of last year, Ryan decided to step down as CEO and promote our COO to be CEO. And he's still executive chairman and he's working on a different project now. And our COO already had a chief of staff working with him. I also don't think I would have wanted to be kind of in the middle of them working through that transition. And so I bounced around a little bit at Bolt, kind of helped with some special projects and stuff. And then Fahad, the CEO of Range, where I'm at now, texted me, and I actually knew Fahad. He used to be at one of the lead investors for Bolt, who led the B round. So we'd interacted throughout the years just as an investor. He's also actually really good friends with the people at Expa, and Expa led Range's seed round.
How full circle is that?
So we started talking, and Range is doing all-in-one kind of personal wealth management. And so it's a space I'm really passionate about. And we're trying to provide the tools to disrupt the traditional advisor industry and allow you to have easy access to ask any question you want about your money faster and more affordably.
Yeah.
So I'm doing all the things there.
I love that. And when we say all the things, like what does all the things actually mean? Because your title is
Head of operations.
And what falls under head of operation?
So really it's pretty much everything G&A. So we're part of a PO, but I'm basically HR, finance. We're an SEC registered investment advisor. So there's a huge compliance component, which is all new to me and I'm learning. We have a compliance consultant we work with. So legal is a big side of it. And then we also have a financial planning team that I'm managing, customer support. So really any kind of function that hasn't been built out or in need of a full-time person, I'm stepping in and supporting right now, with the idea to either hire someone full-time that I still then work closely with, or hand that department off at some point and continue to scale in other places.
Yeah. And so sort of two questions on that. So how did you come up with the title head of ops? Because in a lot of companies that would be considered a chief of staff.
Yes. So Fahad and I are both pretty flexible on this stuff. Like, I don't think either one of us really have a lot of ego around it. I think we both have strong opinions around some of Silicon Valley's tendencies to give away large titles too frivolously. And so we're aligned there, which is good too. I wasn't coming in being like, hey, make me COO,
Yeah.
But I think, my biggest thing in negotiating with him was, when you loop me into an email with an external person, they need to immediately understand and know what I'm doing. And so whatever title you want to give me that you think encompasses all the things you're thinking about right now that I can be helping and doing, that person will understand why they're being handed off to me, then that's what my title should be. And so chief of staff, I think, still felt a little bit too much kind of
Ambiguous.
And just in the CEO specific world versus like, why is Kiah, I don't know, dealing with the compliance consultant or managing the financial planning team or any of these other kind of pieces that I'm doing right now.
Yeah.
We'd also talked about head of strategy. I think that's something as we get bigger, like maybe not I start to move into, but again, at the time that I joined as a 6-person team, like head of strategy is not the one tactically executing on things every day. And so, yeah, we agreed on head of ops.
Yeah, I love that. And like you said, you're doing a lot of tasks right now that you've never had experience with. I think marketing maybe was a part of it, or maybe that ended up working itself out. And then compliance, and you're dealing with compliance consultants. So, that's something that can be very intimidating to individuals to suddenly get a whole department that you've never done, you've never had exposure to before. So how do you sort of handle that ambiguity, handle that, all those unknowns?
Yeah, I mean, I think being organized is like an easy one to miss, or easy, obvious one. But I think having systems personally in the way that I work, that I can really stay on top of things and track them, is really important. I also just like having, like, I wouldn't be doing this right now if I was like, I'm going to go read all the SEC laws myself and try to like figure out how to do this. Like, I'm like, no, we have a compliance consultant. We need them. We're still going to keep paying for them. Like, I have weekly calls with them. I ask 100 questions. Like,
Yeah.
I think just finding, again, those experts that you can lean on, people in my network. I pinged the Operators Guild the other day and was like, hey, we're thinking about doing this restructure thing with our entities, whatever. Has anyone done this before? Like 4 people responded. I got on the phone with all 4 people and was like, how have you done it? Walk me through it. Took 100 notes.
Yeah.
So I think really just trying to like tap experts wherever I can to figure out and learn things, is the only way to, and just like, no, I mean, this is where imposter complex, I think, comes in a little bit, is like the other people don't know either. Like neither of my founders have like run a SEC registered investment advisor before. So like they don't know either. We're not together.
Yeah.
And so just remembering that part of it.
Yeah. And just like you said, working smarter, not harder. There are experts in these spaces that you can either leverage for free, like Operators Guild, except for maybe like a membership fee. And then there's actual, individuals you can pay to get the information you need in a disseminated way to be able to move forward, which I think is super important.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're coming up on time. One last thing. So, I mean, I love working with you, Kiah, and I think other people would love to work with you too. And your team is growing. So, what are some roles you're working on right now that people should be aware of?
Yeah. So range.com/careers has them all listed. We're hiring a ton. We actually just kicked off an operations associate role this last night. So for this crowd, I think that's a big one. If you want to work with me, come apply. And then I think just typical, we're looking for seasoned software engineers, product, financial planners, marketing.
And that's range.com. So range.com/career. Career or careers?
Careers, plural.
Careers with an S. So take a look at that. Is the role remote for the operations associate or is it in
So
office?
that one will be based in DC because part of it will also be kind of helping oversee our office there.
Okay, great. So anybody on the call that's DC based or has DC friends?
Need to relocate, we will help with that.
Good to know. All right. Anybody wants to move to DC? Head up Kiah. She's hiring. Thank you so much, Kiah. It was so fun to do this with you today. I really appreciate you taking the time to be vulnerable and share your story. And I think there's so many important lessons here that can be shared with our community.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.
All right. Have a great day. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.